Tit-for-tat sanctions strain relations between China and the West. The UK, Canada, and the European Union joined the US in sanctioning Beijing for human rights abuses. Australia and New Zealand speak out to applaud their efforts. China retaliates against the European Union, only to face even more pushback. The Chinese ambassador to France has also been summoned by Paris lawmakers. That's after the Chinese embassy called a French scholar a mad dog and little thug for supporting Taiwan. Japan turns its allied nations to bolster defense amid a growing threat from the Chinese regime. And more Chinese people move to publicly reject the Communist Party. One entrepreneur in New Zealand shares his story on how he made the change. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The UK has announced sanctions against 4 Chinese officials over human rights abuses in the Xinjiang region. With this move, the UK is joining the US, Canada, and the EU in confronting Beijing's suppression of Uyghur Muslims.
Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab says the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang is one of the worst human rights crises of our time.
Having very carefully considered the evidence against the criteria in our global human rights sanctions regime, I can tell the House today that I'm designating 4 senior individuals responsible for the violations that have taken place and persist against the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang.
An organisation responsible for enforcing the repressive security policies is also included. The 4 Chinese officials are barred from entering the UK. Any assets found in the UK will be frozen.
Mr. Speaker, in terms of scale, it's the largest mass detention of an ethnic or religious group since the Second World War. I believe one thing is clear: the international community cannot simply look the other way.
It's the first time the UK has targeted Chinese officials with its Magnitsky-style sanctions since they were adopted in July 2000. Some MPs believe the government could do more, including imposing sanctions on Chen Quanguo, the head of Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, and on Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party.
The but for all of this stops with the president of China, who was recently quoted as saying about the Uyghur people that they, the Chinese, should show them no mercy. When do we start calling his name?
Raab says that the UK is taking the action alongside the EU, the US and Canada. The sanctions targets the same officials and organisation.
Australia and New Zealand are applauding the US, Canada, and the EU. That's for levying sanctions on Communist China. In a joint statement on Tuesday, the respective foreign ministers said Australia and New Zealand welcomed the measures announced overnight. They also echoed concerns about Beijing's human rights abuses, directed toward the Uyghur ethnic minority. The ministers went on to say their respective communities across the country share the same concerns. The officials also point out that there is clear evidence of Uyghur abuse. That includes restrictions on freedom of religion, mass surveillance, large-scale detention centers, forced labor, and forced birth control. They are now urging China to let independent investigators into Xinjiang. Amid the praise from the other nations, the European Union is now facing retaliation from China. But EU countries are rejecting the tit-for-tat penalties. The EU imposed sanctions on 4 Chinese officials on Monday. They were targeted because of their roles in the country's human rights abuses, notably in the Xinjiang region. The Chinese Communist Party responded by slapping sanctions on 10 people in the EU. Some of the European countries reiterated their support for human rights afterward, while others did even more to fight back. For one, the Netherlands summoned China's ambassador to The Hague, the city home to the Dutch parliament. And Belgian Foreign Minister Sophie Wilmes announced on Twitter that Belgium strongly rejects the announcement of the Chinese authorities to sanction EU entities and especially EU Parliament members. Germany also joined in. Foreign Minister Heiko Maas wrote on Twitter that China's sanctions against parliamentarians and scientific institutes in the EU in response to China's actions are completely incomprehensible. France is also said to summon China's ambassador to Paris. European Parliament President David Sassoli says he supports the 10 European politicians penalized by China, as well as the other EU individuals and bodies that are affected. A number of European politicians on China's sanction list wasted no time in speaking out, making statements immediately after the sanctions were announced. In a tweet, EU Parliament member Raphael Glucksmann from France called the sanctions his Medal of Honor, adding that the fight continues. Sjoerd Sjoerdsma, a parliamentarian from the Netherlands, also responded, "As long as China commits genocide on the Uyghurs, I will not remain silent." Another parliamentarian, Samuel Cocolati from Belgium, referring to the sanctions, he wrote, "That won't stop us. Our duty as parliamentarians is to defend democracy and human rights." China's move also affects the signing process for the China-EU Comprehensive Investment Agreement. Winkler Gula serves as vice chairman of the European Parliament's International Trade Committee. On Monday, he revealed that the European Parliament decided to cancel a review meeting on the signing of the agreement. The meeting was originally scheduled for Tuesday. He shared the news with U.S.-based media outlet Voice of America in an email. As for the reasoning behind the change, he cited the latest developments in EU-China relations, and especially the unacceptable sanctions from China. On Monday, a spokeswoman for the Chinese regime's foreign ministry responded to the Atlanta shooting in the U.S. She mentioned Uyghurs in China's Xinjiang region, and her words shocked some internet users. The spokeswoman called on the U.S. to treat racial minorities like the Chinese Communist Party treats the Uyghurs. She said, quote, "If the U.S. government can truly care for and safeguard the legitimate rights and interests of racial minorities in the same way that the Chinese government treats ethnic minorities, including the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, then the problem of racial discrimination in the U.S. would have been better solved." She added that the Americans are welcome to visit Xinjiang. Some internet users are feeling confused about the spokeswoman's intentions. One of them tries to read between the lines and comments, "After other races are wiped out, there will be no more racial tension." France has summoned the Chinese ambassador. That's after the Chinese embassy in the country called a French scholar a mad dog and little thug for supporting Taiwan. NTD's Penny Zhou has more.
China's ambassador to France has been summoned by Paris officials. This after the ambassador last week advised French politicians not to meet with Taiwanese officials during their upcoming visit to Taiwan this summer. Beijing claims the self-ruled democratic island as its own territory and has threatened to forcibly reunite it with mainland China. The Chinese embassy also took aim at a Paris-based China expert, calling him a little thug, a crazed hyena, and an ideological troll with an anti-Chinese stance. That's after the expert criticized China for pressuring France about Taiwan and for interfering with French democracy. In a Friday statement, the Chinese embassy accused the expert of kneeling to Taiwan's government and said he, quote, "crazily opposes everything related to China." It went on to justify China's wolf warrior diplomacy style, saying the aggressive approach is necessary because of some so-called mad dogs who use their status as scholars or the media to attack China. The French Foreign Ministry called the Chinese embassy's statement unacceptable. Its foreign minister wrote on Twitter that in their relations with China, there's no room for insults and intimidation against officials and researchers. He also voiced support for the French expert. The ministry said it would remind the Chinese ambassador of the basic rules on diplomacy. Chinese state media published multiple articles targeting the French expert, though the expert called it an honor to be targeted by China. In an interview with French media, he said it's important that French authorities react to the comments. He said, quote, "China is giving us a test. We have to show it that there is a limit and that it has been reached." Penny Zhou, NTD News.
With a growing threat from China on the horizon, Japan is amping up cooperation with allies like the U.S. NTD's Juliet Song has the latest.
The U.S. and Japan have reportedly made a deal. If China gets into a military conflict with Taiwan, the two allied nations will work together to respond to the emergency. Japanese news agency Kyodo News reported the story, citing multiple government sources. It says the U.S. reached an agreement with Japanese defense minister last week that says China has been ramping up its military aggressions. Japan isn't too far from Taiwan, so Taiwan's security matters to Japan as well. But they both face a tricky situation. The Chinese regime sees Taiwan as part of mainland Chinese territory, and it has been threatening to take it back by force. Tensions are rising over the Taiwan Strait. Chinese warplanes have been breaching airspace over the median line. The line marks the unofficial buffer zone between China and Taiwan. China has also been boosting pressure on Japan. Beijing now allows its Coast Guard ships to open fire at foreign vessels if they're in China-controlled waters. The problem is China has disputed waters with Japan, and Chinese ships often enter these areas. Kyodo News says both the U.S. and Japan believe the escalating tensions in the Taiwan Strait could lead to military conflicts. The U.S. brought up the topic of the potential conflict, but didn't give specific solutions. And the Japanese side is considering how to help the U.S. military if it comes to aid Taiwan. The two sides also agreed to hold military drills around the disputed islands. Japan is also strengthening cooperation with Germany. The two just signed a pact to make it easier to share defense-related intelligence. Germany has been closely watching the Indo-Pacific as China's influence grows in the region. Berlin is set to send a warship into the region as early as this summer. A U.S.-based China commentator says the Chinese Communist Party is to blame for the rising tensions.
The Chinese Communist Party is eager to push its plan to dominate the world and its plan of promoting socialism around the globe. It's becoming increasingly arrogant.
Japan's minister is set to visit President Biden in early April. Japan says China policy will be part of the meeting's agenda. Juliet Song, NTD News.
Now we turn to Taiwan. A U.S. congressman is pushing to improve defense cooperation between the U.S. and Taiwan. Representative Scott Perry has introduced a new bill. If passed, it will be much easier for the U.S. to sell advanced arms to Taiwan. Currently, only key allies like Japan and Australia enjoy such benefits. The move is to help ensure Taiwan's security in the face of growing military aggression from the CCP. The Chinese regime sees Taiwan as its own territory, and it has been threatening to bring it under control by force. Fighter jets from China have been frequently buzzing Taiwan's air defense zone. And satellite images show Beijing has been upgrading military airports close to Taiwan. The U.S. doesn't have formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan, but a federal law requires Washington to sell arms to Taiwan so it can defend itself. But the island doesn't enjoy the same benefits as official U.S. allies when it comes to arms sales. And Beijing appears to be very sensitive about the U.S. selling advanced arms to Taiwan. Even though Taiwan sits far away from the United States, the island is critical for America's national security. That's because Taiwan is part of the first island chain. It stretches from Japan to Malaysia. And this line of defense makes it hard for the CCP to launch missile attacks against the U.S. An increasing number of Chinese people are waking up to the threat of the communist regime. One of them is entrepreneur Ding Haijiang. But what made him change his mind? NTD's Becky Zhou has more.
Ding Haijiang is a Chinese entrepreneur based in New Zealand. He's urging more people to quit the Chinese Communist Party and helped spread awareness about the movement at a New Zealand rally. He shared his story with us and explained his motivation. Ding says he used to believe everything the Chinese regime had to say until he lost over $100,000. When he filed a complaint with the authorities hoping to recoup the loss, handcuffs were all they offered him.
I started to see the true picture of the Communist Party. Its lies won't work if you question it.
He had invested in the Chinese stock market back in 2007 after his company found some success, but his fortune was short-lived. The stock index crashed in Shanghai after reaching a record high that same year. Beijing claimed double-digit economic growth despite the hardships brought on by the global financial crisis. Because China didn't own up to its financial losses, he kept his money in the stock market. He says back then he trusted Chinese authorities.
By the end of 2009, I had lost over $40,000, so I questioned what the CCP said.
A few years later, the regime and Chinese state-run media encouraged people to invest in a new company. Its online platform allowed people to borrow money directly from their peers. Ding invested in the company, hoping to recover his losses from the stock market. But he says he realized later that both the regime and its media were lying. The Chinese police soon arrested many members of the company for running a Ponzi scheme, a form of fraud that pays early investors using funds from newer investors. Nearly 1 million investors lost money in the scheme, including Ding. He and other victims traveled to Beijing to file complaints and petition authorities for justice in 2016. Local police arrested some of them.
When the number of petitioners reached 50, the police swarmed and pulled them into a van to send them to a black jail.
Some petitioners held onto a nearby fence when police tried to arrest them. Ding says he saw police officers assault and stab at least one petitioner who was left wounded and bleeding. Ding says the chain of events opened his eyes. He and his family later immigrated to New Zealand. He's one of over 300 million Chinese people that have abandoned their ties to the Chinese Communist Party and its affiliated organizations. He renounced his Communist Party membership with help from U.S.-based website Tuidong, which operates global service centers to help people quit. Ding says he hopes more Chinese people will abandon the Communist Party. Reporting by Becky Zhou, NTD News.
India is warning against unconventional warfare tactics. That's after it suffered a severe power grid shutdown last October, something it since blamed on Chinese hackers backed by the state. Mumbai is India's second largest city and its financial capital, but last autumn it was plunged into darkness, enduring its worst blackout in decades. Thousands of businesses shut down, trains were suspended, millions left without power. It later turned out India may have the Chinese regime to thank for it. Indian officials pointed to state-backed Chinese hackers for causing the power failure. The blackout happened while China and India were fighting over borders in the Himalayas. Both sides suffered soldier casualties. A U.S. research firm suggests the two incidents could have been connected, and that China was sending a message to Indian officials, back down on border claims. Now, India is looking to raise the issue on the global stage. Local media reports citing officials say the country may soon take the Chinese hacking case to international committees. The Mumbai blackout is the latest example of the Chinese regime's unconventional warfare. Without opening fire or sending in troops, the Communist Party can use cyber attacks to paralyze a city and use it as political leverage. India has learned that lesson the hard way, and now experts are calling on the Indian government to cut down on China-made hardware, both for the country's power grids and its critical rail system. American experts are raising similar concerns. The U.S. currently relies on at least 200 power transformers made in China. The hardware is essential for delivering electricity to homes and businesses. Back in 2018, one Chinese company claimed that their gear supported 10% of New York City's power grid. But last year, U.S. authorities seized the company's products, citing national security investigations. China-made transformers were also previously found to include extra electronics that shouldn't have been there. The Trump administration issued a related executive order last May. It aimed to reduce dependence on China for equipment used in the U.S. power grid. President Biden suspended that order on Inauguration Day. It remains to be seen whether he will reinstate it or not. While India is becoming more alarmed by Chinese-controlled power grids, a Southeast Asian country is doing the opposite. The government of Laos signed an agreement with a Chinese-owned company. It allows the company to build and manage a large part of Laos's power grids for 25 years. Radio Free Asia reported on this earlier this month. The company, EDLT, will invest $2 billion in Laos's power grids. When a Chinese state-run company invested heavily in Laos's state power company last year, EDLT was created in response. The Chinese state-run company holds a majority of EDLT's shares. An official for Laos's energy ministry told Radio Free Asia that EDLT would control the high-voltage power line network, including electricity exports to neighboring countries. Some consider it a potentially profitable business. But concerns are also rising. The Laos official says usually in a joint project, the foreign company will transfer the know-how to the host country. But Chinese companies are not like that. He points out when a Chinese company installed the power system at a convention center in Laos, the company didn't provide local people with any instructions. When the power system fails or needs to be upgraded, the locals must ask for Chinese technicians. Laos is faced with increasing debts and economic downturn caused by the pandemic. It is in need of investments. But according to a report from U.S.-based Center for Global Development, the Southeast Asian country was deep in debt even before the pandemic. It's due to loans from the Chinese regime. China and Russia are calling for a summit with the UN Security Council. The request comes as new rounds of sanctions have sent global increased political tension soaring. Foreign ministers from the two countries say the talks will maintain stability. Writing in a statement, quote, "At a time of increasing global political turbulence, a summit of the permanent members of the UN Security Council is particularly necessary to establish direct dialogue." They explain that they are unhappy with recent U.S. behavior and accuse the U.S. of forming so-called closed alliances. Russia and China have labeled European and U.S. sanctions as unacceptable. They are urging other countries to stop what they call interfering in their internal affairs. The United States, European Union, Britain, and Canada imposed sanctions on Chinese officials Monday over their human rights abuses in Xinjiang. Tesla cars are famously high-tech, but spy cams aren't among their known features. Even so, the Chinese regime is banning the cars from military housing complexes. Reuters sources say Chinese officials are concerned that cameras in the cars could be used for espionage, and owners were reportedly told to park outside military property. The Wall Street Journal reports Chinese officials found the vehicles could record images of their surroundings. Now, more than a few car owners could be affected. Tesla sold over 18,000 Chinese-made vehicles just last month. This year, Tesla has been through a series of setbacks in China. 5 Chinese regulators summoned Tesla over quality issues in February. Chinese media also ramped up coverage of consumer complaints, and the company is recalling over 30,000 vehicles that have quality issues. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching, and see you tomorrow.